Hello everyone, my name's Father Paul Denney. I'm the assistant priest at Our Lady of Good Aid Cathedral in Motherwell, and I've been asked to speak to you today by Bishop Toll to give a little reflection on the first reading we'll hear this evening at the Mass of the Lord's Supper. The reading comes from chapter 12 in the book of Exodus, and it's that reading that I think most of us have heard before that gives the prescriptions, the instructions of how the people of Israel are to celebrate Passover, what's to be done with the lamb, what they're to be wearing, what they're to eat at this special Passover meal. But rather than give you a homily on this text, I thought it might be a bit more useful for you to give a bit of a Bible study on this text in Exodus. There's so many masses being streamed all throughout the diocese and all throughout the world that this evening you'll certainly have your choice of homilies to listen to. But instead I thought maybe a little Bible study on this text, its background in the book of Exodus, what's been going on before, what's been building up to this moment, and then what leads away from it, which will help us understand a bit more of what goes on Holy Saturday, the Easter Vigil. To understand a wee bit of that, I think would help us this evening to enter into the celebration. And with that done, then to have a look at Jesus' own Passover with his disciples in Jerusalem. His Last Supper, Jesus ate as a Passover meal. Why did he do that? He could have chosen any meal to have his Last Supper at, but he chooses this most solemn meal, this most sacred meal of Passover in the Jewish people, and that's significant. And we'll have a little bit of a look at why that's the case. And hopefully with this done, then it will help us enter into the celebration of the Mass of the Lord's Supper this evening. So to begin, maybe we can think a little bit about the background that's been going on before we have that reading in the book of Exodus. As I said, it was chapter 12, so we've got 11 chapters before it of narrative to have a think about. We're not going to read it all, but maybe we can just think about the kind of main points. Now we know that the book of Exodus, the first part anyway, takes place in the land of Egypt. The book of Genesis ends there. Joseph dies in Egypt. Joseph, the one with the technicolor dream coat, dies in Egypt. And then the book of Exodus takes up where Genesis left off with the people of Israel in Egypt. Now already that's a bit of a problem, because when we think about it, God promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Joseph, he promised them that they would live in the promised land, the land of Canaan, but here they are in the foreign land of Egypt. So we already know that there's a fulfillment waiting to happen that God has not quite enacted yet. So that's there in the background as well, finishing off in Genesis. But in Exodus we're told that they're in Egypt, but the situation is extremely difficult for the people. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, so this is chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." That's interesting. He didn't know Joseph. These sort of glory days of the people of Israel in Egypt seem to be over already. And he says to his people, the Pharaoh, "Behold, the sons of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war befalls us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. So the people of Israel are seen as a threat by Pharaoh. You know, they're going to multiply and take over, they'll take away his power, his glory. So he decides to enslave them in this heavy labour of building in his kingdom. Later on, we're told that that isn't even enough. He's still threatened. So he says that all the Hebrew males should be thrown into the Nile as soon as they're born to be drowned. Horrible image there. And of course, we know famously that's how Moses is saved, because he's put in this basket with bitumen, he floats down the Nile and is adopted into Pharaoh's household. But that's the immediate context of the book of Exodus, one of slavery, one of death, one of darkness, the people being threatened at every moment, physically, as a nation, everything there at the beginning of Exodus. And they cry out to God, and we're told that God hears their cry. And in doing so, he commissions Moses, his chosen servant, to liberate or help liberate his people from this slavery, from this death in Egypt. And then we all know the story, you know. So Moses goes before Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says no, and it goes back and forward and back and forward. I think we've all seen either Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments for a certain generation. And we see, we know that famous story of the going back and forward between Moses and Pharaoh. And of course, famously, God sends the 10 plagues of Egypt upon Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And they're pretty horrible, it's just when we look at those plagues. And we know it builds up to this most famous or infamous of the plagues, which is the death of the firstborn, and that's the thing that comes immediately after the Passover text that we read this evening. But just before we get to the Passover text that we'll read at the Mass of the Lord's Supper tonight, it's interesting to note the thing that comes immediately before. So we've had this standoff between Moses and Pharaoh going on for a while. He sent all these plagues, but the penultimate plague, the 9th plague that God sends, we're told, is a plague of darkness. And the text is so dramatic. Do you know, it's just God says to Moses, stretch out your hand towards the heavens, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. Strong, dramatic language. And when we think about it, of course, it's a bit of a reversal of creation. We're told that God says, let there be light, and there was light. Now he says, let there be darkness, and there was darkness, a darkness to be felt. The text literally means to sort of feel around in front of you, because you can't see beyond your nose where you're going. You have to feel around. But I think it also has a connotation of, a sort of deeper level felt in our souls, this darkness over the land. But even in the midst of this darkness to be felt, this horrible situation, Pharaoh still will not relent. He will not let the people of Israel go. And the stage is set, of course, for the death of the firstborn in that final plague. So that's the context that brings us to our first reading at the Mass tonight. And that's the context in which these prescriptions, these instructions for the Passover meal are given. So we're going to read the text now that we'll have at tonight's Mass. And it's from chapter 12 in the book of Exodus. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month they shall take every man a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then a man and his neighbour next to his house shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You shall take it from sheep or from the goats. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs in the evening. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the house in which they eat them. They shall eat the flesh that night roasted with unleavened bread, and bitter herbs they shall eat it. In this manner you shall eat it, your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you upon the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall fall upon you to destroy you, when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall observe it as an ordinance forever." So that's the reading that we'll hear at Mass this evening. And there's a couple of things to notice. First of all, it says in the text, so this will be the beginning of the months for you. It shall be the first month in the year for you. So by instituting this Passover, God is saying that, well, actually, do you know what? Time is changing now. And this will be the first thing in the year. This will be the first month for you. So this is extremely significant. We're told that everyone's involved. All the congregation of Israel, all the households are involved. This isn't just something for the priests to do or for Moses and Aaron to do. This is for absolutely everyone to be involved with. And then the lamb itself is such a great focus in the text. It's repeated again and again. And even if the word lamb isn't used, it keeps referring to it. You shall eat it and all of it. It's the focus of the whole text is this lamb. And we're told that the lamb has to be male. It has to be a year old, which is interesting because they say that when a lamb is a year old, it's sort of in its prime insofar as it produces at that point more than it consumes. So this is the best stage for a lamb to be at. And we're told it's unblemished. You know, it's without any kind of fault or anything. This isn't the poor wee lamb, you know, with one eye and a gammy leg, you know, that you might have to kill anyway. You know, that this is the best that you have because it's for God, and we give God the best that we have. We're told that the lamb is to be killed and its blood is to be put on the doorposts of the house. Now, for the Hebrew people, the blood in an animal, in a creature, in a human being indeed, was seen as the life of that person. You know, it's just that's why the Hebrew people don't eat blood. You know, it's seen as something sacred, something given by God. So the life of the lamb is put on the outside of the house. And we're told as well that the whole thing must be eaten. None of it must be left over to the next day. And again, that's significant, especially when we think about the Last Supper and Jesus giving his body to be eaten. You know, this is my body, all of it. It's not part of it, it's all of it. Take this, all of you, and eat it, all of it. And finally, we're told that the Passover in Exodus is to be eaten in haste. We're told, you know, have your loins girded, sandals on your feet, staff in your hands. So you're ready for the off. You're ready to go. This isn't a nice, relaxing dinner. This is something in preparation for what is to come. But all of this Passover, remember, takes place in the context of darkness. This darkness to be felt, surrounded by death. But it's from this darkness that the Lord delivers his people. One final thing worth drawing our attention in Exodus 12 is the fact that this Passover ritual is given so that the angel of death, that 10th plague of the death of the firstborn, it's so that the angel of death will pass over the people of Israel. The blood is on the door so that the angel of death will pass over them. However, all the other plagues, it's interesting, they didn't need this ritual. We're told that in the plague of hail, for example, that it didn't affect the people of Israel. It was only the Egyptian people who suffered because of this plague. So why doesn't God intervene again? Why does he need this other ritual? And I think it only makes sense because the Passover ritual is not just to escape this last plague of the firstborn. The Passover ritual is the inauguration of a new epoch in the history of the people of Israel, in their salvation history. We're told it's a new month for you. It's the beginning of the year for you. Everyone is involved. And immediately after this, they're freed from Egypt. They pass through the waters of the Red Sea, and then they turn around, of course, at dawn and see that Egypt has been destroyed, that they have been delivered by the Lord from death, from slavery. So the Passover begins all of that, and that's why we have this ritual at the beginning, a ritual that's repeated every year. So now we're going to turn to talk about the Passover that Jesus celebrated with his disciples in the Gospels. Now, what's important as well with the remembrance of Passover, when the Jewish people celebrate Passover, indeed as they still do today, they don't just remember what happened all those years ago. It's not just a memorial of something that's long gone to try and, remember what had happened. Instead, they actually relive the event as if they themselves are living it, even if it's hundreds or thousands of years later after the event. They relive what happened. It's a bit like us actually at Mass, we have the memorial acclamation. When does that happen? It happens after our Lord is there, present on the altar in the Eucharist, after the consecration. It is the Last Supper, it is Calvary, it's the resurrection, all of it is there. Our Lord is there, and we are there too. It's not something that we just remember at Mass, it's something that we relive, and that happens each and every time we come to Mass. So too for Jesus and his disciples when they came to Jerusalem to celebrate that Passover, they were reliving the events that took place in the Exodus. And like all rituals, and like all institutions in some way like that, over the years, the Passover ritual grew a little bit from what we have in Exodus 12. Some things were taken away and some things were added. It's interesting to note a couple of the things that were taken away. One is that it doesn't seem to be as a rush anymore. Remember in Exodus we're told that you have to have sandals on your feet, your loins girded, a staff in your hand. You have to be ready, something's there's a readiness, something's about to happen. But that doesn't seem to be there at all in the Gospels, and actually that dropped out by the time Jesus and his disciples were celebrating Passover, because of course they're reclining at table. We're told that beautiful image of St. John resting his head upon the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper. We're told in tonight's Gospel of the Mass of the Lord's Supper that Jesus gets up from table. He's not standing up. They're not standing up ready to go. This is something that's changed. Now, why is that significant? Well, I think one thing we can draw on is Jesus is speaking to Judas in the Gospel. The only time that haste or doing something quickly is mentioned, as it is in Exodus 12, is when Jesus speaks to Judas. He says those ominous words, what you're going to do quickly, referring to his betrayal. And Judas, although he's there with his Lord and God, his friend, celebrating this most beautiful meal, remembering God's salvation, the only thing that's to be done quickly is his betrayal. Go on with what you're going to do. And it still doesn't seem to pull at the heartstrings of Judas. He still seems to go ahead. In Exodus 12, the people have to prepare quickly because the angel of death is coming. They have to prepare quickly because the Lord is about to save them. In the Gospel, the only one who prepares quickly is Judas, who instead of averting death coming, brings death to that house of the Lord. It's interesting. Another thing that had changed when Jesus and his disciples celebrated the Passover was that it wasn't your immediate household. It could be a group of friends, just as Jesus has the 12 apostles gathering round him. Again, it's interesting, he chose not to have that most sacred meal with his mother Mary, which he must have had so many times before. He chose not to have that sacred meal with his friends Lazarus and Martha and Mary, who we've heard so much about in the readings in these days. Loyal friends, good friends. Instead, he chooses the 12 apostles, who we know are weak, who we know are sometimes, power hungry or jealous of each other, and we know certainly that they're all about to abandon him, betray him, deny him. But yet he still chooses to have this most sacred meal with them, and that obviously is significant because this Passover is going to be unlike any other. So that's two things that changed. We might have a look at two small additions that were made to the Passover when Jesus celebrated it. One is questions that were asked. There was a series of questions which had to be asked at various points, and the first question that was going to be asked that night, which I alluded to earlier, was always asked by the youngest of the group, normally a child, but I suppose it would be St. John the Evangelist in the context of the Gospel. And the question he asks is, why is this night different from every other night? Remember, the Jewish people are reliving the event itself. Why is this night, not why is that night, why is this night different from every other night? I wonder if John and the rest of them realised just how different that Passover would be for them. And finally, and maybe most significantly, one big change that had happened with the Passover ritual at the time of Jesus was that there had been an addition of 4 cups of wine which had to be drunk during the course of the meal. Now, none of that is mentioned at all in Exodus. This had become a practice before the time of Jesus and in his time, and continued to be afterwards, that 4 cups of wine had to be drunk in the meal. Now, it was totally mandatory, so much so that if it was a poor family celebrating Passover, wine would be provided for them because it was an essential part of the meal. And I think it sounds like a great addition, 4 cups of wine during the course of this meal. But each one of them was for a symbolic action at different points. Now, I don't have time to go into all of it exactly, but what's interesting is that the 3rd cup of wine that's drunk, which is called the blessing cup or the barakah cup in Hebrew, it's over that 3rd cup of wine, that blessing cup, that Jesus says, this is my blood. This is the blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for you. That's the moment in which the Passover meal with Jesus and his disciples seems to stop, when he says over that blessing cup. Now, the blessing cup was one that everyone had to drink from, that one cup. It makes sense when we hear St. Paul's words in Corinthians when he says, is the blessing cup that we bless not a communion with the blood of Christ? He's not talking about, this image of a blessing cup. No, he's talking about this actual cup at the Last Supper that was used at the Passover meal, that was used, the 3rd cup, that's now Jesus' blood. But there's another cup, the 4th cup, which is called the Hallel cup, which must be drunk for the Passover meal to be complete. And that's the one that comes at the end. At this point, they open the doors and then they sing these beautiful hymns of praise, praising God for his goodness, for his salvation to his people. But that cup doesn't seem to be drunk. In fact, Jesus seems to explicitly reject that cup. He says, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink with you the new wine in the kingdom of my Father. He seems to be putting off this final cup of wine. And the Passover can't be complete until he does so. It's a strange Passover. Why is this night different from every other night? We know then that he goes out to Gethsemane, and we're told that they sing hymns, so this seems to be the Hallel Psalms, although the wine itself hasn't been drunk. What's his prayer in Gethsemane? Father, let this cup pass from me. What cup is he talking about? The cup in the context seems to be, again, this Hallel cup, which would bring the Passover to an end. And Jesus is asking it for him to pass because he's feeling the burden that that's going to be, because this is going to be a new Passover, a new covenant in his blood. Tomorrow on Good Friday, Jesus, the true Lamb of God, will shed his blood for love of us and institute that new and eternal Passover. And it's at that moment on the cross, as he's dying, that he finally completes the Passover. Because what does he do just before he dies? We're told that a sponge was soaked in vinegar or sour wine, put on a hyssop stick. Hyssop is the type of stick that was used to put the blood of the lamb in Exodus on the doorposts. The wine is offered on a hyssop stick to Jesus as he dies on the cross, and immediately afterwards he says, "It is accomplished. It is finished." That's the moment at which Jesus concludes his Passover meal. That's the moment in which the new Passover is inaugurated. The blood of the Lamb has been shed, but the blood of the Lamb of God has been shed. The Lamb once slain to die no more in the resurrection. Fulton Sheen beautifully said that Holy Thursday, the ritual of the Passover, the Last Supper, is what changes Good Friday from a mere brutal execution into a sacrifice. Because at that meal, Jesus points ahead to the sacrifice he will make the next day on Good Friday. He is the lamb that night. That's why no other lamb is mentioned in the meal. He is the lamb that takes away the sins of the world. He is the lamb that sheds his blood so that we might have life, that death may pass over us. Holy Thursday turns Good Friday from an execution into a sacrifice. And Holy Saturday evening, Easter Sunday, is what changes that sacrifice into a sacrament, and that's the Mass. Why is this night different from every other night? Because this night, that is what God does for us. That's what happens for us out of love. We are missing coming together for Mass in these days, both priests and people. But know tonight that your priests will be praying, especially for you, especially for those who are suffering. But know that although you can't be there this night, know that on this night, again, we remember, we relive those events of the Exodus, those events of Jesus and the Last Supper and the Paschal Mystery. This night we gather in the upper room at the foot of the cross and in the Garden of Resurrection. And please God, before very long, we'll all be back and able, with renewed joy, to appreciate that great gift that God has given us in the Mass. I wish you all a very happy and blessed Holy Thursday. And if you can join me again on Holy Saturday, we'll continue our reflection on the readings from Exodus from the Easter Vigil. God bless you.